Was 2016 the worst or the worst year ever? When late-night host Stephen Colbert asked that question, he got laughs. Since then, every year has been named the worst year ever. But for those of us yearning to escape the assault of bad news for better days, it's no joke. Today, we'll debunk the meme that the world is going to hell in a handbasket and look at what the facts show, that life is improving for most people around the world. We just don't believe it. Joining us are four distinguished guests. Danielle Allen, professor and director of the Safra Center of Ethics at Harvard University. Sister Simone Campbell, co-founder of Understanding Us and founder of Nuns on the Bus. Masha Gessen, staff writer for The New Yorker. And Steven Pinker, psychologist and professor at Harvard University. We are really grateful to have this brain trust here today to talk about this very, very, very big issue. And you all come at this from through a different lens. Steven, yours is cognitive psychology, which is the study of how people think and process information, simply stated. Okay. So a lot of people are out on the ledge. You know this. They think it's the worst of times. Never been worse. Every year's the worst. And yet you sail against the prevailing winds of pessimism by standing strong with what you call a radical concept. And that is that things have never been better, and this is really a great time to be alive. What do you know that the doomsayers don't?
Two things. One of them is, I know that our own sense of risk and danger and probability is driven by narratives and images and anecdotes. We don't naturally think in terms of data. Number two, what is journalism? Journalism is a non-random sample of the worst things that are happening on Earth on any given day. You put them together and people are naturally going to think that things are getting worse, especially as journalists become better at covering events anywhere they take place on Earth. For something to be covered in the news, it has to happen suddenly, and most things that happen suddenly are bad things. Good things tend to build up a little bit at a time, but you never see a headline that says, yet again, no war in Vietnam, yet again, no war in El Salvador or Colombia. Nor do you see a headline such as 137,000 people escaped from extreme poverty yesterday, and the day before, and the day before that, and every day for the last 30 years, with the result that 1 billion people can escape from extreme poverty and no one knows about it. So it's not the idea that the world is getting better, on average, not everywhere. The world's a big place, 8 billion people, but the illusion that things are always getting worse is something that is naturally fed by the nature of media, together with our own psychological biases.
You, in your TED Talk, used a lot of statistics showing over the course of time that things are getting better. I mean, infant mortality and poverty, famine, you've mentioned some of these things. So, Masha, by the metrics alone, things are more positive, except for one major area. I mean, I'm speaking sort of generally, but the area I'm going to mention is the demise of democracy around the world, or how democracy is under great threat. Of course, here in the United States, our democracy has been downgraded since in the last, I think it's 4 to 6 years. And I guess the question is, do you sort of subscribe to Steve's optimism?
I do not. But not because of the threat to democracy. It's not actually clear that there's that demise of democracy is the worldwide trend that we're used to saying it is. But there is a war in Europe. There's a genocidal war that we haven't seen the likes of, both in the scale and the brutality and the potential danger, considering that it's waged by a nuclear power. We've never seen the likes of this war, right? And that's what I am confirming what you said about journalists. I have spent the last year of my life covering this war, so obviously that's what I'm thinking about. Like most of us here, or all of us here, I work with students, and I think there's a sense of danger and sort of a lack of future, unlike any we've known in the history of the world, because young people have grown up with the understanding of climate change, and with this incomprehensible idea that they may be the last generation.
Well, I grew up with that as well, because then it was going to be all-out thermonuclear war between the Soviet
Which could have happened or not happened, unlike climate change.
And we were going to run out of oil. We were all going to be shivering in the dark. There were going to be famines that were going to kill billions of people. So it wasn't, I was there. It wasn't so great then either in terms of view of the future. We all had duck and cover drills. We had air raid sirens. We lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Yom Kippur War. The United States put their nuclear forces on alert. So bad things happened there, and I do cite the epigraph that you had on the screen as we entered, that nothing is more responsible for the good old days than a bad memory.
Yes, that was striking, actually. I'm going to get back to totalitarianism later because I think that's something that we're going to want to talk about some more. But first, I want to get Danielle's take on this because you're a political theorist and you are very aware of the fact that we're living in a culture where, as Steve was saying, if it bleeds, it leads 24/7. There are good things happening. We're not aware of them all the time. But how, with all that negativity coming at us, how can we feel optimistic?
Thank you, Jane, not just for the question, but for bringing us all together to have this conversation. I think you make a space for reflection, and reflection is a part of the answer to your question. It's when we actually do have the time to talk and think together that we recover our own sense of agency. And agency is really important to navigating change. I think what we're really talking about here is the challenge of change. Steve always does a beautiful job, Stephen, of providing the macro picture, the whole world over all of time. And he is undoubtedly right that we are much better off than our ancestors thousands of years ago or even hundreds of years ago. But within that, of course, there are some communities that are rising and some that are falling. Ukraine now, on a different scale, deindustrialized communities in our own country, right? And I think paying attention to that lived experience of time is an important part of the conversation.
Sister Simone, David Brooks wrote in The Atlantic that he will acknowledge that he thinks America, at this point we're talking about, is objectively better in a lot of ways, but subjectively we're worse. And Danielle just touched on it. It's because of the lack of community, the lack of collective spirit. People are at each other's throats. You don't see that same kind of bond tour. This is part of your mission right now.
Right.
Talk about that a little bit.
What I've discovered is often, partially because of the media, how it gets set up. But what gets set up in our nation is the difference, the division. And so this group that I'm working with and Understanding Us, we thought, okay, we're going to get the sides to talk to each other. Well, it turned out the sides don't want to talk to each other. But what we did discover is if you come together around a unity, like when we were in rural communities, we brought people together to explain their community to me. I was a city girl. We were out in the rural piece. Explain to me rural living. What we discovered was the unity of being from one geography then allowed political difference to surface. And I think what you're touching on, Jane, is the fact that we don't highlight the places where we are together, that we are united. How do we find ways of being connected when the divisiveness is what's emphasized? And so our work is about bringing people together to be in the unity and then allow the difference to surface in the healing context that I can trust you because we share a connection.
Again, that sounds terrific in theory.
But hard to do one community at a time.
We have people checking lists to see what political affiliations they're going somewhere and they're checking out the guests basically because there's that much sort of antipathy at this point. Part of it is hyper-individualism, which you talk about. And the fact that for the first time Gallup reported that church attendance is down, I think it's less than 50%. Now, there are people who point to that and say, there's the culprit. We're not getting enough spiritual guidance. I've always wanted to ask you that, actually. Are we getting enough spiritual guidance, do you think?
Well, I believe Nuns on the Bus is a great spiritual guide because it's all about exercising shared responsibility and making community in our secular world. And one of the things that gets misunderstood is that church attendance gets equated with spirituality, and that's not necessarily the same. And what's really needed is a sense of solidarity, of that connectedness, that we are in one body, that we are one whole, and I have a part to play. And both knowing that I belong, but also knowing that I have a part to play, then gives me both agency and commitment to the whole.
I want to go back to Steve with this whole notion that nothing's more responsible for the good old days than a bad memory. Because what happens when people start to be negative or pessimistic, they broad brush a lot of things. They lose faith in the institutions very often. And they can get to a point where they think we should burn it all down. So talk about the danger of pessimism if people don't know that there are positive things going on.
Well, I think you've put your finger on it. Sometimes you hear the argument that it's important to play up the catastrophes and the disasters and the negative trends. Otherwise, people will get too complacent. But there's a complementary danger. If you never show that anything works, then people can become either fatalistic. What's the point of trying to make the world a better place if we've been trying that for decades and things get worse and worse, so why even bother? Let's just enjoy ourselves while we can. Or there can be radicalism. Let's just burn it all down because anything that rises out of the ashes is bound to be better than what we have now. Now that can be extraordinarily dangerous because we know that when you do burn it all down, things tend not to get better. Things get a lot worse quickly. There are many more ways for things to get worse than to get better. But also it means that the steps that we've taken that really have made things better, say the laws that regulate pollution, which have led to an improvement in air and water quality, laws to try to lift people out of poverty, which have reduced the rate of poverty, laws to help the seniors, which have reduced the rate of poverty in old age. People can be cynical about the legislative process, about the possibility that reforms, although they can't eliminate problems, they can't make things perfect, they can make things a lot better.
Masha, it's been, why are you smiling?
No, I'm just, I have things to say, but...
What do you want to say?
Well, no, it's just, I mean, it may be an odd thing for a journalist to say, but I really bristle at this idea that people feel that their lives are bad and their future is scary because they don't know enough. People feel that way for a reason. They feel that way because of the things they're actually experiencing in their lives. And I think it's much more informative to ask them what they're experiencing and to try to understand it than to say, let's just give them the information that will make them change their minds, because spoiler alert, it will not make them change their minds. It never does. But, people all over the world, and in this country in particular, and on both sides of the political spectrum, exist in a really scary state of uncertainty. And we know from history that those states of uncertainty create the kind of political crises that we've been facing, and actually can lead to totalitarianism. This is a well-described phenomenon. And the uncertainty that people are facing is economic uncertainty, not necessarily because they're getting poorer, but because they feel like they live in an unfamiliar economic world in which they don't understand how their future is being shaped and how their kids' future is being shaped. And that's a whole different phenomenon. You don't fight it with facts. You actually look at the structures that do objectively create that uncertainty.
Well, can I jump in?
Please.
There's a widely known phenomenon among pollsters, which is that people are always more pessimistic about the country as a whole than their own situation. So you ask, what is the state of the nation's schools? Oh, they're terrible. The kids are learning nothing. What is the state of your kids' schools? Oh, they're not bad. How safe is your neighborhood? Oh, it's pretty safe. What about the city you live in? Oh, you can't walk in the streets, you get mugged. People are informed about the worst things of their city, of their country. It can actually be often worse than their lived experience. Their lived experience often isn't so bad.
See, I read that information completely differently. I read it as, Yes, if you ask me, if I'm making more money this year than I did last year, then this is not terribly common. But let's say I do, or my kids are getting a decent education. But I live in a world of overwhelming uncertainty. It's scaring me, so I'm going to ascribe it to the Upper West Side in New York City, where I've never been.
Danielle?
Well, I do think the important point here is that underneath any of the macro statistics, there are a heck of a lot of individual lives and stories. And this point came home really powerfully to me the day after the 2016 election. I was on a panel a little bit like this, trying to process the results. I had a colleague in the economics department, and we were chatting before the panel began. And he said, we economists, we always knew globalization was going to take 20, 30 years to work its way through the system. Globalization, meaning the opening up of markets and the like. Globalization, to Stephen's point, has lifted economic well-being for millions of people around the world. Sort of the level of poverty in China has decreased immensely because of globalization. So the economist said, I always knew it was going to take this long to work its way through the world. And then he said, but I've just realized I never stopped to consider what it would feel like to live through those changes for 25 years if I were in a town where the jobs were leaving. So he had a great grasp of the macro aggregate picture and the way it was improving things, but had literally never taken the perspective of the person living through the negative component of those changes. And at the end of the day, I think the hardest challenge that we have is both to understand that broad brush picture of progress, secondly, to understand what actually drives that and permits us to achieve that for societies, but then thirdly, also to see the places where we're seeing a falling, not a rising, and to understand how, in human terms, we should be responding to that.
My focus is more about how you bridge this gap of, as Masha's saying, you can't just give people the information and expect them to feel better because on a visceral level, they don't, and they're not going to. And you can tell them that poverty is not as bad as it once was, but it doesn't change their own kind of angst. How do you communicate things differently?
Well, the question is not how do you communicate things differently. The question is what do you communicate?
Okay.
And I think what do you communicate is, you don't try to tell people you're actually better off than you think you are. Not going to work. But you say a better future is possible.
That's right.
But I think one of the critical pieces in that, Masha, is defining what better is. What are we looking for? And then to define together how we achieve it. And I do talk about this unpatriotic lie of individualism, is that our country is not founded on individualism, which Ronald Reagan started that trajectory of saying that it was. The fact is we're founded in community. And we need to recover that of a shared dependence and a shared responsibility to build this future together. And once we're connected, then it is a lot easier to take in new data, new information, because it's not left to me alone. And I think that's some of the big shift that, well, certainly you were talking about, Danielle, is that sense of solidarity, of knowing our connectedness.
So I'll give another example, if that's okay, and try to also think about this question of what we do then, right? How can we build something from this? Another statistic we've all spent a lot of time talking about in the last 10 years is the increase in the mortality rate for white men without high school degrees. And you'll have heard the phrase deaths of despair, that there's been a rise of substance use leading to death and suicide and the like, specifically for white men without high school degrees. If you look at the level of the mortality rate for that category of our society, it has gotten worse for them. And at the same time, for African-American men without a high school degree, their situation has gotten better. However, their getting better has brought them exactly on par with where white men now are. So that tells me anyway, that it continues to be the case that for really important members of our society, we're all important, everybody's dignity matters, we haven't established a foundation for flourishing. The whole globe may be lifting up, but that doesn't mean there isn't work to do. And so I think to Simone's point, the question really is, how can we name and see all those experiences, do the hard work of linking arms across difference to say, these are problems we're going to solve together. I think that takes leadership, in all honesty, but that doesn't mean it has to be elected officials. Leadership can come from everywhere, every community, as you just said. But I think there has to bring that spirit of respect for human dignity and a desire to really understand. For those people who are saying something's wrong, let's hear them and try to understand what it would mean to put a foundation for flourishing there.
In the last, ever since COVID, though, ever since the pandemic, we've been dealing with an overlay of a different dynamic, which is that you've got the isolationism, you've got the post-truth era, which has started to become even more extreme, and people being more alone. And Steve, I know you're asked all the time, how can people believe in conspiracy theories? And how can people be science deniers? And where is all this misinformation coming from? Which I do think has exacerbated, Masha, people's feeling of fear. I mean, just abject fear, like, I didn't grow up in this. The country was stable. Things were fairly normal. We observed certain behavior. And now I feel like it's totally off the rails. So, Steve, what do you say? I mean, this is about reason and enlightenment, which you talk about, and we'll talk about now.
It's good to keep in mind that the natural human condition is to believe in superstition and conspiracy theories and paranormal woo-woo and miracles. A fact-oriented, science-driven mindset is very unusual in human history. So we've carved that out. A lot of it depends on trust in the institutions that try to achieve the truth, like science, like responsible journalism, like government record-keeping agencies. When trust in those institutions go down, people just fall back on the natural human tendency to go on rumor and conspiracy and mythology and superstition. Conspiracy theories are, we have always had. The protocols of the Elders of Zion blame the world's economic problems on a Jewish cabal. There are conspiracies of Freemasons and Catholics, and that's just the natural condition. Belief in miracles, that's what Holy Scriptures are all about. And they're the original fake news spread of paranormal phenomena.
Right.
So we should not think of it as a decline, but rather we always have to carve out a kind of beachhead for vetted fact, empirically demonstrated conclusions against the natural human tendency to fall back on conspiracies. So we need to shore up the institutions to restore the trust in science, in journalism, in public health officials. Has to be a constant process of establishing our best truth-seeking institutions against the natural human tendency to fall back on rumor and superstition.
Well, that was before social media.
It's not just social media, it's also partisan cable news shows and AM talk radio. It's also the segregation of people into different neighborhoods. People with a college education tend to stay in cities. The rural tend to be the ones who aren't college educated, more tend to hang out with one another. There is a decline in civil society organizations such as churches, but also bowling leagues and service groups. And so people from different social classes tend to rub shoulders with each other less. And that tends to all together with social media to create these bubbles of people with like-minded opinions.
Well, I was just thinking of an example coming from a spiritual component, which is not woo-woo or disconnected from historical or scientific reality. But when we were in West Virginia, I was with a group, we were doing a town hall, and these old guys sitting in the back started ragging on California. And they were just, crazy Californians. They should fall off into the ocean. They're just going on. And I said, hey, wait a minute, guys. I'm from California. Don't go, you want to run me out of town? What's going on? And they said, oh, well, they didn't know I was from California. So they backed up. But then we took time to try to figure out why they would rag so easily on California. And what they came up with was that they had not met a Californian since they had been drafted for the Vietnam War. They had no contact with actual Californians. So we got talking about the need for some sort of community service or a year of engagement where our nation has a chance to meet each other. Because absent a lived experience, just hearing about it is not going to make that big of a shift and that they can forget over time. So I became a proponent of this whole idea of community service, doing a year of service so that we can build a nation that now knows each other across various state boundaries.
I have to say, you came to prominence in a way where you stood up to the Pope and you stood up to the Catholic Church and you stood up to the US government in the interest of social justice, economic justice, and trying to help people. And I think the first time I ever saw you on television, you said that you were stomach acid in the body of Christ.
Yes.
that you were basically somebody who was a rabble-rouser and you were going to keep doing that. Now, you sound really mellow here today.
Well, but I think being the contrarian to the woo-woo spirituality part is a piece of that trying to bring a different layer of truth. But I also think that it brings life experience, because what we did was lift up the experience of ordinary people in our fight for health care, for the Affordable Care Act. That's what got us in trouble. And the Vatican thought we should be working on gay marriage and abortion issues, but our effort was economic justice. That was our mission. And so we stayed faithful to what our mission was, but it was misunderstood by the men who wanted to control us for other reasons.
How'd that work out?
We won. It was great.
Masha, I want to go back to a conversation I saw you have with Tim Snyder, and who famously wrote on tyranny and a lot of other amazing books. And you were talking about how loneliness can drive people. It's this whole kind of breeds authoritarianism. Talk through that a little bit, because I also think that's part of what we're going through right now.
Absolutely. I think what we were talking about is that, according to Hannah Arendt, loneliness is the defining condition of totalitarianism. Loneliness is what totalitarianism produces, and it's also what it feeds on. And I think that, I just want to react to what Stephen and Simone said, that, there's fundamentally not a huge difference between believing in what we call science and believing in conspiracy theories. Most people are not able to read medical papers and come to their own conclusions. And I think that, suggesting that we show people that this is data-driven and data-proven is a little bit, unproductive, because most people are not. I'm not in a position to, to read the data and draw a conclusion about the vaccine. I make a decision to believe in something, right, based on who I think is credible, but also based on the people I talk with and the people I'm in community with, right? And I think that what you were saying is that when, especially during the pandemic, people were left so profoundly alone to make up their minds. And if you also think about the way we talked about the pandemic and what people's responsibilities were, there was not a single state in this country that had a public health information campaign that was based on messages of interdependence and community. Every single state had a public campaign, to the extent that some of them had them at all, about individual responsibility, right? You're alone with this thing. It's your responsibility to do this. It's your responsibility to wear a mask. It's your responsibility to protect others. And it's your responsibility to get the vaccine. Not a single state had a public health campaign that said, we're all in this together, right? That began with a sense that there was something that was actually bringing us together, not something that was just forcing people to stay home and do things alone. And when you're alone, and you feel lost in this world of information, you're going to make decisions that, yes, decisions about belief that feel most comfortable. But I don't think that, we need to make such a huge distinction between sort of the natural state of people believing in woo-woo and the advanced enlightened state of people believing in science. Fundamentally, those are the same decisions.
I agree that if you show people the data, then their eyes will certainly glaze over. But if you convince them that this is that behind the scenes, we can show our work. This is why we're not just a priesthood, but if the facts change, we would change our recommendations. We are not a wing of the Democratic Party. We're not a wing of the Republican Party. To restore the trust in institutions that reached a high mark in the 1960s and has been in decline ever since, although it was low before that as well.
Decline
that is,
story.
Trust in institutions is not such a common human situation. But that's, I think, crucial for aligning people's belief in our best guess at the truth, simply because it's true.
I would have to challenge that, to be honest.
Okay, you challenge it.
So, I mean, I did a fair amount of COVID work and public health work, and I did the work I did mostly with mayors around the country. So I can't, precisely count through sort of what I saw in different states in response to your comment, but I know for a fact that there are plenty of mayors who made the core of their public messaging around the pandemic that we're all in this together. And in fact, I do think where we saw success in the pandemic, that's exactly what people were doing. And a lot of folks in the public health space spent a lot of time trying to think about exactly that, how to activate that sense of sort of in it together, working on this in a shared way. And sometimes what that can mean can be surprising. There was one mayor where the way that everybody was in it together was that, this is how we're going to get football games back again. We all love football games in our community. This is how we're going to get football games back again, is by doing these things together. So, I think I often say when we are wrestling with the question of common ground and, bad versus good and so forth, that one of our greatest challenges is how oriented we are to the national discourse. Mm-hmm. And I do think the national discourse gives us a very rigid, polarized picture that is not true to actual experience in communities across the country. Sometimes I point to state-level ballot propositions as a good example of the kind of counter story. If you look at national elections, we're always sort of split 50-50 in recent years, and it just feels like we're at each other's throats. If you actually look at the results for state-level ballot propositions, we pass measures with supermajorities a surprising number of times. So a supermajority means more than 2/3 of the voters are voting for the same thing. That means people from both parties. And these are surprising examples. So Mississippi in the last election, or 2020, I guess, passed a ballot proposition to change the state flag, to get rid of the icons of the Confederacy and replace them with forward-looking symbols that would signify the state's commitment to inclusion. Supermajority vote passed that in the state of Mississippi. In Florida, they achieved a supermajority ballot proposition to restore voting rights to people who had completed service of their felony conviction. Republicans and Democrats voted for that. In other words, you look around these examples and what you see over and over again is Republicans and Democrats actually at the state level managing to come together to stick up for the people who are getting the short end of the stick. And for me, that's a real source of hope, a real indication that we do have the resources that we need to name our problems. Your questions are really tapping into, I think, what is a shared sense of anxiety, right? And that word anxiety has been coming up a lot. And I think everybody in the audience feels anxiety about where we are. We do have the resources to, again, link arms, name problems, and find some solutions to that.
And that's really, I talk to a lot of very anxious people. I know a lot of very anxious people. It's almost like there's this, Steve, this willful kind of, well, maybe some good stuff is happening, but again, does it put sort of things in a different perspective when it just seems that it's overwhelming. It's like you thinking about climate crisis and nuclear war. And your point is that we should look at those as problems to be solved, not as cataclysmic events that might happen. How do you do that?
Yeah, well, you have to show that sometimes problems can be solved, that this isn't utopian, it's not romantic, it's not idealistic, that there really are, compared to, say, the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there are fewer wars, there are fewer people killed in wars, that the crime rate is much lower than it was just a few decades ago, that the war on poverty was not a failure, that there really are a fewer percentage of people in poverty, that the air really is cleaner than it used to be, so that the attempt to make things better doesn't seem like a pipe dream, like something that only romantic folk singers could long for. But the fact that it's happened in the past means that at least it's not crazy to think that it could happen more in the future if we decide to solve those problems.
Masha, I want to go to the disparity between wealthier democracies that seem to be, again, we're being general in this discussion, less happy, less content with where they are, a lot of people. And then if you look at low and middle income places like Kenya, Indonesia, they're showing a higher, and you're nodding, did you do that research?
No, I didn't do it.
Okay, but you know about it. Gallup did a poll. 85% of people, Americans, allegedly, are pretty satisfied with their lives. But 17% think the country's on the wrong track. Now, how do you sort of square those? I mean, that's a lot of disparity to deal with. How do you address that?
So some of the striking fact is that in countries, in upper income countries, people are more satisfied with their lives, but they're more pessimistic about the future. So some of the most optimistic countries are like India, Bangladesh, China. The most pessimistic country is France, which is actually a pretty nice place to live. But people's perception of which way things are going is, as you say, disconnected from their satisfaction with their own lives.
There's a great book called The Spirit Level. I don't know if you've ever come across it.
Absolutely.
It's a terrific, detailed, empirical book exploring the relationship between inequality and frustration and disappointment in contrast to egalitarian societies. And so when we talk about sort of the progress of wealth in wealthy countries, we are talking, again, at the macro level, the aggregate level. Our national GDP, the GDP, the gross domestic product of the West, has increased mightily. At the same time, in the last 50 years, we have seen this incredible increase in income and wealth inequality, to the point that it's at the same level as it was before 1929, sort of beginning of the Great Depression and the like. And just lots of evidence supports the idea that when you have a society where communities are more connected and the economy is empowering people in a more egalitarian way, and this doesn't have to mean redistribution, it can just literally mean that you're investing in education, you're investing on all the building blocks that actually give people a chance to live empowered lives, you have a higher level of happiness as well. These things go together. So you can actually be making progress in macro terms, even at the same time as you're eroding some of the underpinnings of an experience of well-being.
You're like human Google. Simone, it's a compliment. Simone, I've been like sitting here just dazzled, mesmerized.
He's the human
You're
Google
all
over
human
there.
Google as far as I'm concerned, actually, today. Simone, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics came out and said you're much better off if you're a lumberjack in terms of personal happiness. I mean, this is a profession that will bring you great satisfaction and fulfillment. And I know you toured a lot of these more rural areas. What's your experience in terms of people choosing to be outdoors or that sort of occupation? Was that your experience, that they were more satisfied with their lives necessarily?
I think what we found in our rural roundtables was that people chose to stay in rural communities. And at the end of each one, I would ask, well, what do you like about living here? Because we've talked about problems. What do you like? The smell of the morning dew on the grass, the sound of a bird's first morning twitter, the sense of a sunrise and being able to see it on the field or over the trees. It was all about nature and beauty. And being connected to nature and making a difference in nature help them stay rooted, not just in the natural world, but in each other. One woman told me, you know, in the city, you go to a demonstration and you're anonymous, there's no consequence. You know, it's not that we're conservative in rural communities. We're just careful of our relationships because there are consequences if we demonstrate, if we show up. We care more about our relationships than necessarily being in the headlines.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I thought so, because what it really was that sense of solidarity, of linking arms, that there are consequences. If we're connected, then I'm going to be respectful in a whole different way of different points of view, and also know that I could be vulnerable to getting a bit ostracized if I get too far beyond the rails.
Masha, how worried are you about the fact that civics education, that you've got a younger population that isn't as well versed in knowing how things work, how the government works. There's been a loss of faith. I mean, you work with them, as you said earlier. Give us a sense of how they feel about the time that we're living in terms of pessimism versus optimism.
Well, I'm actually much more concerned about the disappearance of local media than I am about civics education, because I think that the sense of living in what we think of as democracy is probably rooted much more, used to be rooted much more in local newspapers and any kind of local reporting than in a semester or a year of civics classes that you get in school. And yeah, what I see among my students, which is obviously a very particular kind of subset, it always is, right? But a sense of futility, a sense of disconnectedness from what we call the democratic process, which is not surprising, right? They look at these extremely old people who keep getting elected. They feel quite powerless. There are also reasons why voters and potential voters on college campuses feel powerless, because we make it very difficult for young people to vote on college campuses, and all of that, and the sense that that if you consume media, you always consume media about other people. Right, it's what used to be true. Right, it was very much a reflection of the small communities that people lived in, and these are the true good old days when you did, in fact, everybody knew journalists, everybody knew the people who were in the local newspaper. The community in the democratic process that was described was familiar and was about things and people you know. But that's no longer the case for the vast majority of people in this country.
Tim Snyder had done the show a couple of times, and that was one of the key themes. That was his takeaway at the end of one show. And he said, local media, we've got to somehow rebuild, rejuvenate local media. And yet, you're a journalist, you see the economics of what's in the business. Do you see that as feasible?
Well, we have to change our entire way of thinking about media. I mean, media is a public resource. We should think about media the way we think about clean water, right? We need to have clean water in every community, and we need to have local media, reliable local media, publicly funded local media in every community. Otherwise, we can't have any hope of a democratic society.
Danielle, go ahead, Masha.
No, I was just going to say that there's some great innovation in the local media space, but I think until we realize that the advertising model of media, and still online, it's still advertising driven. The idea that you can piggyback on commercial advertising in order to provide an essential civic service is crazy. We don't ask the Senate to rent out space in the Senate to support its existence, and we shouldn't ask what we think of as the fourth branch of government to do that, to do the same. It worked accidentally for a few decades, but it's not going to work again, and it shouldn't.
I want to ask you, Steve, if your experience with your students or with younger people, is it the same sense of why bother, kind of, in terms of the political scene, or?
There's some of that. There are people who don't want to have children because they think that the world won't be around for the children to grow up, which is completely wrong. But there's a lot of diversity. There are a lot of students who are hoping to help come up with a new generation of clean energy technologies, or public health interventions, or better vaccines or Alzheimer's drug treatments. That's the kind of energy that we really want to nurture and mobilize. And I think it does depend on some degree of confidence that it isn't a waste of time, that things really can get better.
But if you look at the actual stats, Danielle, and I know you do work in this because you're spearheading a program at Harvard, the Democracy Knowledge Project, which comes out of a place where it's like 1 in 4 what are the stats? Go ahead.
Well, it really is an alarming statistic.
Yes.
It's that this is work by political scientists named Yasha Mounk and Roberto Foa. If you ask members of the generational cohort who were born before World War II, whether they consider it essential to live in a democracy. About 70% say yes, it's essential to live in a democracy. If you ask that same question to millennials, which is actually not that young anymore, right? That's sort of just around 40 and just below, not quite 30% will say it's essential to live in a democracy. That's alarming because you can only have a democracy if people want one. And it suggests that we have not succeeded at what I consider a sort of generational responsibility of succession, generational succession. Each generation should be passing to the next an understanding of constitutional democracy, motivation for, and so forth. But I want to underscore the specific kind of challenge we have right now with folks who are 20, 21 and the like. It helps just to remember what major events have punctuated their lives, right? They were born just after September 11th. They lived through and could feel the effects of the Great Recession. They felt the turbulence and polarization that have characterized our politics basically from 2009 till the present. And then they lived through a global pandemic. And just contrast that to the 20 years of life that honestly any of us in this room had our first 20 years. All kinds of major events, Vietnam War, civil rights movement and so forth, but I don't think any other generational cohort has had a first 20 years recently with that many really globally difficult events. So it makes sense then when they say I don't consider it essential to live in a democracy because the democracy that they lived in, here's what it's delivered as best as they can tell. So we do need civic education. We're working on, we've got a curriculum in about a dozen districts in Massachusetts, a year-long grade 8 curriculum, and we're doing a lot of work to make the education engaging, to empower young people, give them a sense of agency, even in the face of anxiety and fear sometimes and so forth. But the other thing, honestly, is if we want to re-engage young people in our democracy has to be worth their time and effort.
You know, and I think a corollary of that, Danielle, is that how do we have conversation, dialogue across generations so that the questions of the young and the old and the middle can all find a place where they can come together to explore answers. And one of the scripture scholars, Walter Brueggemann, says that a critical piece for creating community is effective discourse across generations. And I add and cultures. Because if we don't find a way to talk to each other, we don't have a way of nurturing different experience and letting young people know this is not the given forever. Yeah. How do we move forward?
May I just add one thing?
Surely.
Sometimes this can sound like a romantic point, right? Like let's just all talk together. People always say to me, isn't that the kumbaya line, Danielle? Yeah. But it's not. It's really practical. It's really concrete. And you wanted sources of optimism in this conversation. For me, a real source of optimism is that over the last decade in this country, there has been an incredible explosion of civil society organizations, local groups, doing work on bridging, bridge building. It's like it's a whole new field of activity.
Yes.
It's amazing how fast it's growing. That, from my point of view, is all I need to know in order to answer the question of whether we're going to get out of the mess we're in.
Steve, in terms of sort of teaching people, and this goes back to sort of the beginning of what I talked about in terms of life skills. I know this sounds really basic, but that's kind of been a theme, is how you get people to relate to each other more. What's your experience in that area?
Well, certainly face-to-face contact inhibits a lot of the aggression that we can easily exhibit online and on social media. People are very happy to call someone a fascist or a racist or a deplorable on social media, but you wouldn't go up to someone's face and say that. Just normal human inhibitions force us to be more civil. So I think there is ground for the value of face-to-face conversations. But also, the more our problems are peeled away from the partisan right-left divide, the greater the chance of solving them. There are studies that show if you give people a policy proposal, like this is how we'll deal with healthcare, or this is how we should deal with welfare, and if you say this came from a Democratic politician, then the Democrats would say, oh, great idea, and the Republicans say, terrible. But if you have the same policy and just flip the labels, and they're all fictitious, then the approvals also flip. So a lot of issues, as soon as they become attached to one or the other side, people become much more polarized than they would have been if they just dealt with them as problems to be solved. This is true for a lot of issues. Climate change was not always as polarized as it is now. If you go back 30 years, then there wasn't a huge left-right divide. Somehow we missed an opportunity when it came to, say, vaccines and masking to keep it divorced from politics. Now, of course, it's not easy to depoliticize these issues, but it is one of the reasons why often local politics could be more constructive than national politics. People have to get together and they have to build a sewer system or protect the coastline from erosion. Then they also have to acknowledge climate change if they actually see it as a problem and they're responsible for solving it.
I'm just realizing that we're almost out of time, and I'm going to get maybe one more question in for each of you. And Danielle, I want to ask you about the fact that you did run for office. You ran for governor of Massachusetts, and you wrote about the fact that when you started that campaign, you were not bereft, but you were in despair. You were angry.
Yeah.
And when you stopped, you
I felt great. I did. It was true.
Well, there's a recipe. Just run for office and stop.
There you go. It's a comparative. Okay. But seriously, I mean.
Yeah. Well, no, it was a beautiful experience. We do have this shared narrative about how cynical and alienated we all feel, disconnected and the like. And I had the great opportunity to visit with people all over the beautiful state of Massachusetts. I had zero name recognition when I started. People really did not know me from Eve. And so that meant, as I met people in their living rooms, in cafes, in backyards, I found that they were ready to share with me the most intimate and raw details of their lives, what wasn't working, what ideas they had about how to change that. But again, remember, they didn't know me from Eve. They didn't trust me. I was just this person coming in off the street saying, I'm Danielle and I want to be your next governor. But so what I took from that was they wanted to share with me out of an incredibly deep faith in our institutions, because this person might be the next governor, and our government should be doing things and working on our behalf. So that was very restorative for me. It was just time and again to witness the depth of the faith so many of us do have in the work we do together through our political institutions. It was restorative.
Masha, aside from local media, in terms of takeaway from this broadcast today, I've heard you say, or I guess I've read, that you think that having an imagination in dark political times is absolutely essential.
Well, that's the only way we get out of them is, yes, by saying a better world is possible, and we're capable of creating it.
But for people who don't have a clue what that means or how they can be part of that, how do people, if they want to do something proactive, what can people do?
Well, if people want to do something proactive, they should do whatever they can do. There's always a very simple answer to that. I mean, people are always asking me, what can I do to help people in Ukraine, or what can I do to help asylum seekers or refugees? Do what you can do in your community, right? There's always somebody that you can help in your community. And, it's always more effective. And getting in the room with other people, as Stephen was saying, is always a more effective way of getting engaged in politics than going on Twitter or sending a donation via the internet.
Simone, I'm gonna end this with you, because you were awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, presented to you by President Biden. He said you were a source of hope and progress for our nation, and he called you a beacon of light.
I know, yes.
And you responded basically by saying that all of us have a responsibility. What's the responsibility?
I believe our responsibility is to do what Masha was saying, have holy curiosity, connect with others, talk to people about what matters to you, and ask the question of them, Well, what matters to you? Don't insist on just saying your point of view. Holy curiosity to learn from others. And then the second virtue, I say, for the 21st century is to have sacred gossip. Sacred gossip, not ordinary gossip. Sacred gossip is sharing what you heard. Spread the news about what other people think. Like I tell stories of people that I've met around the country whose concerns I treasure and value, who may not be the same as mine, but because I shared them here, we've multiplied them. That's what we need to do.
Sacred gossip.
Sacred gossp.
Not Harry
Yes.
and Meghan.
No. Okay. Just so that was curious, but not sacred, yes.
How optimistic are you going forward?
Oh, I have hope. I have hope in the fact that we will come together. We hunger for it. That's why we're here tonight. We hunger for it.
On that note, I don't know what to say except you all were absolutely extraordinary, and we're very grateful that you were here. And we always go out on a silver lining moment in this broadcast. And today's silver lining moment is set against the backdrop of Steve Pinker's extraordinary photographs, which not only reflect his signature optimism, but remind us of what's at stake in the fight against climate crisis. First, both NASA and the UN broke good news about how the ozone layer is shrinking, and if mitigation efforts continue, is on track to be healed within decades. Plus, the Tree of Life grew last year thanks to the debut of 351 new plant and animal species, which scientists say will strengthen the ecosystem. And finally, courtesy of the canine version of Sister Simone's Nuns on the Bus, we leave you with a smile. Take care.
Good morning, Jake. Well, good morning.